Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Everyday English Channel with Tom and Kate. We're really happy to have you with us today.
Yes, thanks for being here again. And today we're going to talk about a situation that almost everybody experiences at some point, going to the doctor. Even if you're healthy most of the time, there will probably be a moment when you need to explain a symptom, answer a few questions, or understand some simple medical advice in English.
That's true. And I think this topic makes many English learners a little nervous because health is important. People worry about not finding the right words or misunderstanding what the doctor is saying. But honestly, most conversations at a doctor's office use very simple English. The questions are usually clear, and the answers are often short and practical.
Exactly. And before we continue, if you enjoy these calm and practical English conversations, you can subscribe to the channel or share this episode with someone who is learning English. It really helps us, and we really appreciate it.
So let me ask you something. Are you someone who goes to the doctor as soon as you feel unwell, or do you usually wait a few days to see if things get better on their own?
I'll admit it, I usually wait. If I have a cold or a small headache, I normally think, it'll probably be fine tomorrow. I like giving my body a little time before making an appointment. Of course, if something feels serious or unusual, that's completely different. But for small, everyday illnesses, I tend to be quite patient.
I'm a little more cautious than you. I don't go to the doctor for every little problem either, but I think it's important to pay attention to symptoms instead of simply hoping they disappear. And actually, symptom is one of the most useful words in medical English. A doctor might ask, "What symptoms do you have?" Or, "When did your symptoms start?"
Yes, and another word people hear all the time is appointment. Before you even see the doctor, someone might ask, "Do you have an appointment?" Or, "What time is your appointment?" That word is useful in many situations, not only for doctors. You can have an appointment at the dentist, the bank, or even the hairdresser.
Another thing that happens in almost every medical conversation is describing how you feel. People usually don't use complicated vocabulary. They simply say things like, "I have a headache," "My throat hurts," "I've been coughing," or "I don't feel very well." Those are probably some of the first health-related expressions that English learners should know because they come up so often.
Yes, and I think people sometimes worry too much about using the perfect medical word. But honestly, doctors are used to hearing simple descriptions. Instead of trying to sound technical, most people just explain what they feel. They might say, "My back hurts," or "I have a sore throat," or "I've had a fever since yesterday."
That's a good point. Doctors usually ask questions to understand the situation better. They might ask, "How long have you felt like this?" Or, "Does it hurt all the time?" Or, "Have you taken any medicine?" Those questions are very common, and once you hear them a few times, they become much easier to understand.
Yes, and I've noticed that doctors often ask one question at a time. They don't usually expect long explanations. They ask something simple, you answer, and then they ask another question. That actually makes the conversation much less stressful than many learners imagine.
Another thing people often say before visiting the doctor is, "I hope it's nothing serious." I think we've all had that thought at some point. Even when it's probably something small, it's natural to worry a little until you know what's happening.
Absolutely. And that's why staying calm is important. Most medical appointments are simply conversations where you explain your symptoms, answer a few questions, and receive advice about what to do next. The English itself is usually much simpler than people expect.
Exactly. Once you know the basic vocabulary and understand the most common questions, visiting the doctor becomes much less intimidating, even in another language.
One of the first things a doctor usually asks is, "What seems to be the problem today?" or "What brings you in today?" At first, those questions can sound a little unusual because they're not always translated literally into other languages, but they simply mean, "Why are you here today?" Personally, I like that question because it gives people the chance to explain the situation naturally before answering more specific questions.
Yes, and most people answer with very simple sentences. They might say, "I've had a headache for 2 days," or "I've been coughing since last week," or "My stomach has been hurting." You don't need long explanations. The important thing is to describe what you feel and, if possible, when it started.
That's true. And actually, doctors often ask about time. They might say, "When did it start?" or "How long have you been feeling like this?" Those questions come up in almost every medical appointment because they help the doctor understand whether the problem is recent or has been there for a while.
Yes, and I think learners sometimes forget how useful words like since and for are in these conversations. For example, you can say, "I've had this pain for 3 days," or "I've been coughing since Monday." Those are very natural answers, and you'll hear them all the time in English-speaking countries.
Another thing doctors usually want to know is where the pain is. They often ask questions like, "Where does it hurt?" or "Can you show me where the pain is?" Personally, I think "Where does it hurt?" is one of the most useful medical questions because it's short, simple, and extremely common.
Yes, and the answers are usually just as simple. People say things like, "My back hurts," "It's my shoulder," "My knee hurts when I walk," or "I have pain in my neck." And honestly, you don't need advanced vocabulary to explain those things. Simple body parts are often enough.
Another question doctors ask quite often is whether the pain is constant. For example, they might ask, "Does it hurt all the time?" or "Does it hurt when you move?" Those questions help them understand the problem more clearly.
I've also noticed that doctors often ask if anything makes the pain better or worse. Someone might hear, "Does it get worse at night?" or "Does anything help?" And those are useful questions because they encourage simple answers like, "It feels better after resting," or "It hurts more when I stand up."
Another common part of the conversation is talking about medicine. A doctor might ask, "Have you taken anything for the pain?" or "Are you taking any medication at the moment?" And actually, medication is another useful word because you hear it in hospitals, pharmacies, and doctors' offices.
Yes, although in everyday conversation, many people simply say medicine. For example, "I took some medicine this morning," or "The doctor gave me medicine for my cough." Both words are useful, but medicine is probably the one learners hear most often in daily conversations.
Another thing that sometimes surprises people is that doctors ask about allergies. They might simply ask, "Do you have any allergies?" It's a short question, but it's important because it helps the doctor choose the right treatment.
Yes, and the answer is usually very straightforward. Someone might say, "No, I don't have any allergies," or Yes, I'm allergic to penicillin. And actually, I'm allergic to is a very useful expression that people should remember because it can also be important in restaurants or when traveling.
Another thing I like about medical conversations is that doctors usually speak calmly. Even if you're nervous, they often explain things step by step and ask one question at a time.
Exactly. They're not expecting perfect English. They simply want to understand what you're feeling so they can help you. And once you realize that, speaking English at the doctor's office becomes much less intimidating.
Another thing that happens during many medical appointments is the physical examination. After asking a few questions, the doctor may want to check your temperature, listen to your heart, or examine the part of your body that hurts. You often hear simple instructions like, take a deep breath, open your mouth, or can you lie down, please? These are very common expressions, and they're usually spoken slowly and clearly.
Yes, and doctors often explain what they're doing while they examine you. For example, they might say, I'm just going to check your throat, or I'd like to listen to your breathing. I think that's reassuring because you always know what's happening. Even if your English isn't perfect, the situation feels calm and easy to follow.
That's true. Another thing doctors often ask is whether you've experienced the same problem before. They might say, has this happened before? Or have you had this pain in the past? Those are useful questions because they help the doctor understand whether the problem is new or something that comes back regularly.
Yes, and people usually answer with simple sentences. Someone might say, yes, I had the same problem last year, or no, this is the first time. And honestly, this is the first time is a very useful expression because you can use it in many situations, not only at the doctor's office.
Another common part of the conversation is describing whether you're feeling better or worse. A doctor might ask, are you feeling any better today? Or has the pain improved? Personally, I like the word improved because it comes up quite often in medical conversations.
Yes, although many people simply answer with everyday language. They might say, I feel much better, it's getting worse, or it's about the same. Those answers are short, natural, and exactly what doctors expect to hear.
Another thing that often happens is that the doctor gives advice instead of medicine. For example, they might say, you should get some rest, or make sure you drink plenty of water, or try to avoid exercising for a few days. Those are probably some of the most common pieces of medical advice people receive.
I've definitely heard those before. And actually, get some rest is one of those expressions that people use everywhere. Friends and family say it too, not only doctors. If someone isn't feeling well, it's very common to hear, get some rest and take care of yourself.
Another situation people experience is being sent for additional tests. Sometimes the doctor wants more information before making a diagnosis. They might say, I'd like you to have a blood test, or we're going to arrange an X-ray, or I'm going to refer you to a specialist. And actually, specialist is another important word because it refers to a doctor who focuses on one specific area of medicine.
Yes, and although hearing that can sound a little worrying at first, it doesn't necessarily mean something serious. Sometimes it's simply the best way to understand exactly what's causing the problem. I think it's helpful to remember that doctors often want more information before making a final decision.
Another thing people ask before leaving the appointment is what happens next. They might say, when should I come back? Or should I make another appointment? Or how long will it take to recover? Those are practical questions that help people know what to expect.
Yes, and doctors usually answer very clearly. They might say, "Come back if you're not feeling better," or "Take this medicine for a week," or "If your symptoms get worse, give us a call." The advice is usually simple because the goal is to make sure the patient understands exactly what to do.
And honestly, that's something I really like about medical English. The conversations are usually calm, structured, and based on clear questions and clear answers.
Exactly. Once you know the most common vocabulary and expressions, visiting the doctor in English becomes much less stressful because the conversation follows a very natural pattern.
When you look at all these situations together, you realize that visiting the doctor is really just a series of simple conversations. You explain what you're feeling, answer a few questions, listen to some advice, and make sure you understand what to do next. The English itself is usually much more straightforward than people expect. Personally, I find that medical conversations become much less stressful once you know the most common expressions. You don't need to know complicated medical vocabulary to communicate effectively.
I completely agree. And I think many learners imagine they need to sound like a doctor themselves, but that's not true at all. Your job is simply to describe your symptoms as clearly as you can. If your head hurts, you say, "I have a headache." If your throat hurts, you say, "I have a sore throat." Clear, simple English is usually all you need. And honestly, doctors are very good at asking follow-up questions if they need more information.
That's a really important point. People sometimes worry because they can't remember the exact name of a medical condition, but most conversations never require that level of vocabulary. If you can explain where it hurts when it started and how you feel, you've already given the doctor the most useful information.
Yes, and another thing I like is that doctors usually speak in a reassuring way. If everything seems normal, they often say things like, "I don't think it's anything serious," or "You should feel better in a few days." Those simple sentences can immediately make patients feel calmer.
On the other hand, if the doctor wants you to be careful, they also explain things very clearly. You might hear, "If your fever gets worse, come back," or "If the pain doesn't improve, give us a call," and actually, "if, then." Advice is very common in medical conversations because doctors often explain what you should do depending on how your symptoms change.
Another thing people sometimes forget is that they can ask questions too. If you don't understand something, it's completely normal to say, "Could you explain that again, please?" Or, "What does that mean?" I think learners sometimes feel embarrassed about asking doctors to repeat something, but it's much better to ask than to leave confused.
Absolutely. Doctors want patients to understand their instructions. You can also ask practical questions like, "Should I take this medicine before or after meals?" Or, "Can I go back to work tomorrow?" Or, "Is it okay to exercise?" Those are very natural questions because people want to know how the advice fits into their everyday life.
And speaking of everyday life, many conversations at the doctor's office are actually about simple habits. Doctors often ask whether you're sleeping well, drinking enough water, exercising regularly, or feeling stressed. These aren't difficult questions, but they come up quite often because your daily routine can affect your health.
Yes, and that's another reason this vocabulary is so useful. You're not only learning English for doctor's appointments, you're also learning words that appear in conversations about lifestyle, sleep, exercise, food, and well-being. The vocabulary connects naturally with many other everyday topics we've already discussed on this channel.
That's true. Health is part of everyday life, so these expressions become useful much more often than people realize. Whether you're traveling, living abroad, or simply having a conversation with an English-speaking friend, it's helpful to know how to describe how you're feeling.
Exactly. And once you're comfortable with these common questions and answers, going to the doctor in English becomes much less intimidating. Instead of worrying about finding perfect words, you can simply focus on explaining your situation clearly and understanding the advice you're given.
Before we finish, thank you very much for spending this time with us today.
We hope this conversation helps you feel more comfortable speaking English at the doctor's office and describing your symptoms in real-life situations.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe to the channel or share it with someone who is learning English.
It really helps us grow, and we truly appreciate your support.
Join us in the next episode for another calm and practical English conversation.
Thanks again for listening.
And remember, keep speaking English every day.